In this module, I want to talk a little bit about how much should you actually order, and how do you create and deal with the pro forma invoice and your purchase order. Now, later on in this week, Steve Simons is going to be a special guest, and he's going to come on and talk about how to really protect yourself when creating an order with your factory in China. But I just want to go over some of the basics and things that you need to consider right now in this module. Now, remember the 2.5 rule that I stated earlier that says if you have $5,000 to invest, you need to divide that by 2.5 to determine what is the maximum you can spend on your initial product. So that would mean $2,000 on your initial product if you have $5,000 to invest. So keep that in mind when you're actually doing this. Now, there's something called inventory terms that's very important in business. And inventory terms is basically your cost of, the formula is your cost of goods sold, or your COGS, divided by your average inventory. And basically that means is how many times do you sell out of your inventory every year. So if every 3 months you're ordering 1,000 units, and at the end of 3 months you're down to basically zero, and then the next 1,000 units come in, that would be 4 times per year that you're having to order the inventory. So every 3 months you're ordering 1,000 units and you're selling through them. The next 3 months, ordering another 1,000, selling through them. So basically your inventory would be turning 4 times per year. And as a seller on Amazon, that's pretty much the minimum that you want to shoot for. In some cases you may be at 6 or 10 or 12, but you can have a profitable product. But if the inventory turns are less than 4, it's going to be hard to get a good ROI on it. For example, I had in the past a crepe maker, and this crepe maker was a good seller. It sold for like $50. I had a good profit margin on it, but it just sold a handful per day, and I was ordering too much of the product, and it would take me about 6 months to sell through it. Now I would make a profit, but I was tying up my money for 6 months, and so my ROI on that particular product wasn't so good. But because of the MOQs and because of the shipping cost, I had to order more, and I just couldn't sell more, so I ended up dropping that product. But my inventory turns were only 2 because I was only selling through what I was ordering every 6 months. So I ended up dropping the product and deploying my money into something else that could give me a better return on investment. Now, so that's an important number to remember. And then there's a formula that I like to use to actually determine how much should I actually order. How much should you order on your on any given order? Now, remember that we went through a spreadsheet earlier on, the product evaluator spreadsheet. This will calculate a lot of this for you based on what you input. But I just want to explain the formula a little bit to you, so you understand it, or if you want to calculate it on your own. So basically, you need to take the manufacturing time in days. So if your manufacturer says in this example, let's say it's 30 days to make your product. You're going to take the number 30. You're going to add that to the shipping time. Let's say your freight forwarder says it's going to take 28 days for it to go on the sea and another 7 days for it to get into the Amazon warehouse. So that's the number 35. So you're going to add 30 plus 35. So now you're at 65. Then you're going to add 10 extra days for delays. You might have your container might get inspected. There might be a port congestion. There might be a strike. Who knows? There could be whatever reason you missed the selling date because the truck was late showing there and you got to wait another 5 days for the next ship to leave. So we add another 10 days. So now we have our 30 plus our 35 plus our 10. So we're at 75. And then the next thing you're going to add is you always want to keep at least 30 days worth of inventory in stock at Amazon if at all possible. So I'm going to add 30 to that number. So now we're at 105 if you add all those numbers up. The next thing you want to do is add for your launch. Now, if you've already launched, you can subtract this out. But if you're just now launching the product, you're going to add 10 days for launching because you need to do a process to actually launch the product before it really starts getting some momentum. So now we're at 115. And then you're going to multiply that by how many that are selling in the target position you're trying to shoot for. So let's say you're shooting for a position between spots 3 and 8. And let's say they're selling, your targets to sell is 10 per day. So you're going to take that 115 and multiply that by 10. And so that 115 multiplied by 10 is what you're actually going to order. So that's 1,150 units would be the recommended order for your initial order for when you're first launching. Now you'll take out the launching period later on because you're not going to need that, so that would reduce your next order. But by then maybe instead of selling 10 per day, you're selling 12 per day. So it could adjust the number upwards. So that's the general order formula that you want to keep in mind on how much should you actually order. In this module, you should be able to download an example pro forma order with a Chinese factory. Now what happens a lot of times is when you decide to place an order, your factory will actually send you what's called a PI, or pro forma invoice. And then a PO is actually a purchase order. So when they send you this PI, it's usually an Excel spreadsheet, and it will spell out the pricing, the factory's name, it'll tell you where to send the money to, and a number of other things. And that PI is important, and you should always get one of those. But then you want to counter that with an actual purchase order. You can use the PI if you want to, and just consider that your purchase order, but you lose some rights if you do that. So I would recommend actually taking that information and creating a purchase order and sending that back to the factory. Now, there's some important things you got to include on that purchase order if you're doing that. Now, the purchase order it can be mailed, it can be faxed, it can be emailed. Any of those are fine, but just keep in mind that a purchase order will take precedence over any kind of email chain. A purchase order is actually enforceable, versus if you're just going back and forth on email and you got an email chain of what you've all agreed, that's actually not enforceable. The PO is actually like your contract, and it's your agreement. And so it needs to be as specific as possible. It needs to be in simplified Chinese, and English. So any of the main specifications you need to have both in English and in Chinese. You need to make sure it matches the PI. So whatever the factory sent you, make sure it matches that as far as pricing and specifications. And then you can add your own specifications to it. Like, for example, if whatever the payment terms are, you're going to add to that. If the factory has agreed to fix defects, you're going to add a clause about how they're going to fix or handle defects. They're going to credit you on the next order, or give you a refund, or whatever it is, or they're going to apply the cost of the sample to this order, and it's going to get deducted. You're going to specify that. You're going to specify what happens if an inspection fails, who pays for the reinspection. Or you can specify if there's penalties. What if they told you it's going to take 30 days and they take 60 days to make this? Well, that's kind of screwing you. So what I like to do is I like to put in a clause that says if they say 30 days, I'll say something like, okay, if it takes more than 40 days before it's ready for inspection, then for every day after that, I get a 1% reduction in the invoice cost. And that forces them to make sure, if they agree to that, someone won't agree to that, but if they agree to that, then that forces them to make sure they get this thing done on time and they don't bump your order behind somebody else. Another thing is you've got to be very, very specific on what's on that invoice, on the colors. If it's a specific color, don't just say blue. Say it's Pantone 372 or something like whatever the Pantone color is. Be very, very, very specific. You got to be very specific in dimensions. Put them in centimeters. Not in inches. You got to be very specific if there's a gloss on it. What is the gloss level? What is the fabric type? If you have the material numbers, a lot of materials and fabrics have an actual number, specify that. If you're wanting your outside cases to be in a 3-ply, 3-wall box, you need to specify that. Anytime you can include pictures along with these specifications, that's even better. So like if you can include a picture, like I want a 3-wall box, and you show a little picture of a 3-wall box and what it looks like, a cutaway, so on the side where you can see it's like 3 walls, it's extra strong, put that in there. Every single item that's in your order, if that ab roller that I showed you earlier, you would want to put every one of those pieces, put a picture of like, these are all the pieces that are supposed to be in there, and these are what their dimensions are. You're going to be very, very specific, and these are what their colors are, and this is what's expected on the inspection. This is what it's acceptable failure rate and what's not acceptable. All those things have to be specified precisely on there. Now, if you don't do that, the PI will take precedence over the PO. So you got to make sure you do that. Some other important factors is that the company's name actually has to be in Chinese. It has to be in Chinese. It can be in English too, but it has to be in Chinese characters on the actual PO. So that's super important as well. Another thing that's really important is the jurisdiction for it to be enforceable. It has to be in the district where the factory is located. So you actually have to specify. It's like saying in the U.S. The jurisdiction is California or Texas. In China, they have states and provinces and stuff as well. So you have to actually specify precisely where this is enforceable on the contract. If you have any questions on this or it gets complicated, there are lawyers that specialize in Chinese law. You can find them in China. Or there's some in the U.S. There's one in Seattle it's at the ChinaLawBlog.com. They're not cheap, but those guys can actually, if you have some complicated issues or it's a very complicated thing, you can reach out to them, or sometimes just read their blog, and they'll specify some of the things that you may need to know on there. Another thing that you can have the factory do is, once you've agreed to everything, is actually have them stamp it with their CHOP. And a CHOP is like usually in red ink, and it's like a seal. It's like a seal of the factory. It's kind of like a signature. And if it's stamped with that CHOP, that actually makes it official. And just remember that the contract is not enforceable in the United States. It's only going to, if it's a Chinese factory, it's only going to be enforceable in China. So if you do have a problem, you're going to have to deal with it in China. But just the fact that you're laying everything out, the factory wants to save face, they want to do the right thing, you're making sure there's no misunderstandings and everything is clear from the get-go. Never make assumptions on anything. Always write it down in the contract. Never assume, yeah, we talked about that, they know to do that. Always be very specific and write every little thing down. It's okay to go overboard and make sure there's no ambiguity and no misunderstandings. Because if you don't write everything down, the rights and responsibilities of each of the parties is not completely spelled out. And if that's the case, you're usually the one that's going to be on the short end of the stick, not the factory. Remember, these agreements are a deterrence from them straying and doing wrong, as well as a legal agreement if you have to enforce it. Sometimes these will end up going to arbitration if there's a problem. You know, I've had an agreement in the past with one of my suppliers that was making the crate maker, and I paid the deposit. It failed the inspection, and the factory refused to fix the problems. And the problems on it were there were little scratches on the bottom. Down, if you turn the thing over, it had little feet on the bottom. If you turned it over, there's some scratches on the bottom, like down where the label and stuff would be on the bottom of it, that says the UL certificate and all that kind of stuff. And the factory said, it's no big deal. It doesn't affect the performance of the unit. It still works. It still cooks. It does everything fine. What's the big deal? And I said, no, this cannot come to the United States. People will think this is used or scratched or damaged. I can't have that. And they're like, well, it's no big deal. The thing works. And so we fought about it. And we went back and forth for about a month. And I told them, to heck with it. Y'all can keep them. And then they threatened me back saying, well, we're just going to sell them and strip your name off and send them to somebody else. I'm like, go for it. I'm not paying you. And at the end of the day, we ended up negotiating. They ended up fixing the problem and ended up shipping them to me, and everything was fine. But part of that's because we had it in the agreement and they want to save face. So this is why it's super, super important to have a PO, get the PI from them, which is what their understanding is. Then you change it into a PO and send that back to them and get them to put that CHOP on there and to agree to it. And that's going to really help you. Steve is going to talk about this later this week in another module about some of the other legal issues that you need to keep in mind when you're dealing with foreign companies and foreign manufacturers. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and look forward to seeing you in the next module.